Hi there everyone, it's Gary Ablett here. I'm just wanting to do a short clip exposing something that I feel needs to be exposed for the Australian people to know about, especially with current circumstances concerning our country and the way our government is running this country like a dictatorship. And I'd like to reveal why that is happening. And Mr. Albanese seems to be running his own show. And that is because back in 1973, the Whitlam government actually changed the Constitution and violated Section 128 of our Constitution that makes it very clear that any changes to our Constitution, however small, however subtle, needs to be through the right legal processes, including with the approval of the Australian people via a referendum. So let's take a look at Section 128 of our Constitution. It says, "This Constitution shall not be altered except in the following manner. The proposed law for the alteration thereof must be passed by an absolute majority of each House of the Parliament, and not less than 2 nor more than 6 months after its passage through both houses. The proposed law shall be submitted in each state and territory to the electors qualified to vote for the election of members of the House of Representatives. And if in a majority of the states, a majority of the electors voting approve the proposed law, and if a majority of all the electors voting, that's you and me, also approve the proposed law, it shall be presented to the Governor-General for the Queen's assent." Now, the Whitlam government didn't do that. They've stealthily and subtly changed the Constitution by altering what is called the Royal Style and Titles Act. Now, the Royal Style and Titles Act basically is the terminology used to represent the Crown, the monarch, that we're a part of the Commonwealth under the authority of the Queen of the United Kingdom, Queen Elizabeth II. However, the Whitlam government violated Section 128 of our Constitution and just went ahead and altered the Royal Style and Titles Act, which technically is treason, and they basically removed wording. The original wording of the Royal Style and Titles Act was, it's Queen Elizabeth II, by the grace of God of the United Kingdom, Australia, and her other realms and territories, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith. Now, the Whitlam government just went ahead and done their own thing and stealthily and subtly changed the wording of the Royal Style and Titles Act, which, as I say, is technically treason, because it's the reason Section 128 of the Constitution is put in there is to protect the Australian people from this very thing. So politicians and authorities can't just go ahead and change the Constitution without the Australian people's approval, prior knowledge and consent. But they did. And what they did was they removed Queen Elizabeth II of the United Kingdom. They removed of the United Kingdom and replaced it with the fictitious Queen of Australia, completely taking the wording of the United Kingdom out and replacing it with the fictitious Queen of Australia. And also they completely removed Defender of the Faith out of the Royal Style and Titles Act. Now, this is treason. You can't do that. That is a very clear breach and violation of Section 128 of our Constitution, which was put in there for this very reason, to stop that. But I'm exposing this now because I want the Australian people to realise how corrupt our Parliament is and has been now for over 50 years. Now, the consequences of this are horrendous. Now, by removing the wording of the United Kingdom and replacing that with the words Queen of Australia, and removing of the United Kingdom completely out of there, and they completely removed Defender of the Faith, they've actually severed lawful ties to the Crown of the United Kingdom. And now we need to realise the High Court judges all know about this. This has been they've been aware of this since it happened. But so far, no one has successfully challenged this in the High Court for whatever reasons. But the consequences of this are very serious for our country, because most people would realise that all our authority in Australia is derived, or is supposed to be derived, from the Crown of the United Kingdom as part of the Commonwealth and under the authority of the Crown of the United Kingdom. However, by removing those words of the United Kingdom and replacing them with the fictitious Queen of Australia, they've actually severed lawful ties to the Crown of the United Kingdom, and that, as you know, that is where we get all our authority from, as part of the Commonwealth under the Crown of the United Kingdom, and her seal, Queen Elizabeth's seal of her riding a horse, is where all our authority is derived. Now, by removing those words of the United Kingdom and replacing them with the fictitious Queen of Australia, they've actually severed lawful ties to the Crown of the United Kingdom, and that is where we derive all our authority, which legally and lawfully speaking has actually rendered all authority in Australia null and void. So there's a huge question mark now over every level of authority in Australia, from the government to the police force, the justice system, the Australian Taxation Office, and all councils. Basically, every level of authority in Australia has a huge question mark now over their legal and lawful standing. And do our politicians actually have the constitutional legitimacy and legal and lawful authority to actually be in our parliament? Because the question now needs to be asked, since we're no longer under the authority of the Crown of the United Kingdom, King Charles III, whose authority are we under? And who is the King of Australia now? Now it's obviously, it was the Queen of Australia. Now it's King Charles III, King of Australia. Now, the King of Australia has actually no constitutional legitimacy, nor legal or lawful standing. So this is really serious. The consequences of this are far-reaching within our country. And the questions that it raises over the legitimacy of our parliament, our police force, as I said, our justice system, the Australian Taxation Office, and all councils, practically every level of authority. Where are we getting our authority from, since it's no longer from the Crown of the United Kingdom? This is serious stuff. This needs to be exposed, investigated and corrected, because right now, the truth is, it would seem that our whole country is operating under fraudulent governance. And who are our politicians accountable to? And my humble opinion is, I'll tell you who I think's running our country now: the UN, the World Economic Forum, and the global elites and co are telling our government what to do and what not to do. And our politicians aren't really running this country. They're just puppets, doing what they're told by the UN, the World Economic Forum, and the global elites and co. And that's why I believe we're in the mess we're in today. And this is so serious, as I said, this should shock and rock every Australian, this nation to the core, because we are no longer connected to the Crown of the United Kingdom or part of the Commonwealth. Since they altered that Royal Style and Titles Act, this country has been operating under fraudulent authority ever since 1973, and I encourage every Australian to have a look at our constitution prior to 1973. So let's take a look at the Royal Style and Titles Act prior to 1973. It reads, Elizabeth II, by the grace of God of the United Kingdom, Australia and her other realms and territories, Queen, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith. And they went ahead and stealthily altered it to read, Elizabeth II, by the grace of God, Queen of Australia and her other realms and territories, head of the Commonwealth, and they've completely removed defender of the faith. So now it's just the King of Australia. And as I said, that has no constitutional legitimacy or legal or lawful standing. Whose authority are we running under? Who is running our country? And who are our politicians accountable to? Because obviously the way they're running things, they're not accountable to anybody. That's why Mr. Albanese and his government, and I would say most of the politicians in our parliament, which I believe are corrupt, are running things like a dictatorship. And they're getting away with it. And they don't need to answer to the Crown of the United Kingdom because they've severed lawful ties to the Crown of the United Kingdom. This is really serious stuff, guys. Now, if we let them get away with this and we don't call them to account for this treasonous act and raise the questions that need to be answered here, as I've said, whose authority is our country operating under? And who is that authority coming from? And who are our politicians accountable to? Because right now it seems like it's no one. That's why I need to expose this to the Australian people. That's why Mr. Albanese and his government and most of our politicians, who I believe are corrupt, and I'm sure most Australians would agree with me, because he can just do his own thing, because we are no longer under the authority of the King of the United Kingdom. And there is the fictitious King of Australia has no legal or lawful standing. So our whole country has been running under fraudulent governance since 1973. And I also, that raises the questions, since we've severed lawful ties to the Crown of the United Kingdom, that raises serious questions over every law, every legislation and bill that's been passed since 1973, because they were not done under legitimate authority. Even all our assets that have been sold off overseas deliberately, and by doing so, they've sold off our sovereignty as well. I mean, I'm sure most people would realise the Australian continent is so rich in minerals, and in so many ways, we are the Saudi Arabia of the Southern Hemisphere. And yet here we are, not just in debt, do you know we're $1 trillion in debt? $1 trillion. And yet, look at our country, the wealth that's within our country. And here we are, $1 trillion in debt, and costs of living are at an all-time high. Many Australians can't afford homes, can't afford to buy, can't afford to rent. And yet, as I say, we should be one of the richest countries in the world, totally self-dependent. And yet here we are, broken in $1 trillion debt. And it's not just poor management, it's what saddens me even and angers me more is it's deliberate. And these questions need to be answered. And I want to keep this message as short as possible, but The Australian people need to rise up here, because if we allow our corrupt politicians like the Whitlam government to get away with that, what else are they doing in secret? What else are they changing? What else are they getting up to that we're not aware of with all the shifties they're pulling? Just like Mr Albanese in his voice referendum, and yet most Australians don't realise, Mr Albanese said that the voice referendum was only a couple of pages and it was all about, improving our relationships with Indigenous Australians and giving Indigenous Australians, a say in Parliament and stuff, which they already have. But what he didn't tell us and hid from us is that if the yes vote had got through, that 80% of our land rights would have been transferred to the ownership and control of transnational globalists through a secret treaty with Indigenous Australians. Something Mr Albanese forgot to tell us about. And I think, as the media are saying at the moment, Mr Albanese comes across as a pathological liar. He does not have a problem compromising with the truth whenever it suits him. And if he continues to be leading this country, if he continues in power, our country is not only going to self-destruct, but we'll soon be communist, because we have Mr Albanese and his government are a social communist government. We all know that. And we also know just the way our country is being run at the moment is just a sham. And what Mr Albanese will do to hang on to power, including mass immigration of certain peoples who I believe are playing a significant role in destabilising and destroying this country from within. But getting back to the main issue here, back in 1973, the Whitlam government changed their constitution. They altered the Royal Style and Titles Act and violated section 128 of our constitution, which is technically treason. And many of our High Court judges are aware of this, and yet it's all been covered up. And these things we can no longer afford to go along with things just being covered up like this. It's too serious. And if we're going to get our country back, there needs to be exposure, there needs to be an investigation, an honest, transparent investigation into this, and it needs to be corrected, and we need to get our country back on its right foundations, where it's operating under legitimate authority. Now, if the people of Australia want to vote that we become a republic and move away from being under the crown, then that's fine. But that's up to the Australian people. But it wasn't done that way. And by doing so, they've, as I say, they've severed ties with they've severed lawful ties to the Crown of the United Kingdom. And so ever since 1973, it would appear, and I say appear, that we're operating under fraudulent governance. Whose authority are we operating under? Who is this fictitious King of Australia? Because it's not King Charles. And who are our politicians accountable to? That's why they're doing their own thing. That's why Mr Albanese and his government are running the country like a dictatorship, because they're not accountable to anybody. And this needs to be exposed, investigated, and I was going to say maybe a royal commission, but the fact that we've severed lawful ties to the Crown, how can we have a royal commission? Because we've severed lawful ties to the Royal Crown. This is an absolute joke. And while correcting this will it will be complex, it has to be done, because we can't afford our country to go on operating under fraudulent governance, and without these things like treason, where the Constitution or the Royal Style and Titles Act's been changed violating Section 128 of the Constitution, where it's been illegally and unlawfully changed, we can't just afford to sweep that stuff under the carpet and expect that our country is going to be blessed and function and operate in a healthy manner. So this needs to be investigated. And I would call High Court judges out there that you need to deal with this, because we can no longer afford to treat treason and corruption and deception going on in our parliament so lightly and just sweep it under the carpet like no big deal. It's just it was just a structural change. It's no real big deal. Well, the question has to be asked, why did they do it in the first place? And what are we going to do about it? Because something has to be done. We can no longer afford to be operating under a fraudulent governance. Where are we getting our authority from? Who's really running this country? Who are our politicians accountable to? Because it would seem no one, and that's why they're behaving like a dictatorship. So I'm going to leave you with a short clip from Tim Dwyer, who has put together a very short video, because we need to realise, do the Australian people realise that the Australian government is no longer a government? They are now a corporation. And that's why they're running this country like they are, like a dictatorship, doing their own thing. And even the seal, Australia's current seal, has nothing to do with the monarch, the Crown of the United Kingdom, King Charles. See, when Queen Elizabeth II passed away, we were supposed to get a new seal from King Charles, but we haven't done that. And ever since 1973, as I say, we are no longer a government. The Australian government is no longer a government. It's a corporation, and it has its own seal, and it just looks like a big 50-cent piece. And that, the Crown of the United Kingdom and the seal, Queen Elizabeth's seal, is where our authority and power comes from. Since we've severed ties, lawful ties, to the Crown, and we're no longer a government, we're now a corporation with our own corporation seal. Where is our authority coming from? Because it's not coming from the Crown of the United Kingdom anymore. So these questions have to be answered, and I would encourage the Australian people to look up the Australian Constitution before 1973, where you will see the way the Royal Style and Titles Act was, and how it's been changed to the fictitious now King of Australia, the fictitious King of Australia, and that terminology has no constitutional legitimacy or legal or lawful standing. So there's a lot of questions that need to be answered, and I think it's time, with the mess that this country's in, that some of these things need to be resolved, exposed, investigated and corrected. Because the way we're heading, we need to resolve these issues and deal with them transparently and urgently, and get our country back on the right track and back on legitimate foundations.
This is the document, the letters patent that created the office of the Governor-General by Queen Victoria, and on the bottom of it there is her seal. The seals are where the authority lie. It is in the seals, and how the seals are granted and created. There it is. Now, in modern history, our last monarch before Charles was his mother, Queen Elizabeth. This was Queen Elizabeth's great seal. That was Elizabeth's seal. There she is upon the horse. Just like that was Queen Victoria's seal. This is Queen Elizabeth's seal. This is the seal that was given to us in 1973, or should I say, forced upon us in 1973, or should I say, snook in 1973. The previous Great Seal of Australia, which was first authorised by royal warrant, was not, in 1973 by Gough Whitlam, Elizabeth II, Queen of Australia. Let's see. Now, this is the final report on a Constitutional Commission of 1988, Volume 2. The treasonous political parties are still trying to get the Queen of Australia recognised, as they have been using the Queen of Australia since 1973. Unlawfully, but they've been using it because it sounds about right. You know, we're busy, we've got football, we've got all sorts of stuff going on, and we haven't got time to worry about politicians and what dribble they come out with. That was the ethos back in the day. So if it sounded about right, it must have been about right. But it was all wrong. A bill for an act to alter the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act by omitting obsolete words and so as to recognise the Queen of Australia. Be it enacted by the Parliament of the Commonwealth of Australia with the approval of the electors as required by the Constitution as follows. What that means is, for this to come in, there must have been a referendum on each of these following points. Each point, because it alters the Constitution. This Act may be cited as the Constitution of Australia, Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act 1988. The Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act is altered by omitting the words. Now, remember what it said, obsolete words, right? Omitting of the words, be it therefore enacted by the Queen's most excellent majesty, that's the PowerPoint, that's where the energy is, the most excellent majesty, by and with the advice of the consent of the Lords Spiritual, Lords Temporal, and the Commons in this present Parliament assembled, and by the authority of the same as follows. They wanted to pull all that out. That's their theory. Get rid of the Crown, get rid of the Commonwealth. Next bit. Act extended to the Queen's successors. Section 2 of the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act is altered by omitting of the words the United Kingdom and substituting the word Australia. You see, this is Gough Whitlam and Bob Hawke's socialistic, communistic, gradualism, wet dream to have Australia an absolute basket case that they control. Operation of the constitutional laws, Section 5 of the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act is altered by omitting all the words after and including and the laws of the Commonwealth. Well, let's do that. Repeals Section 7 and 8. And one of the interesting things about Section 8 is it talks about the Colonial Borders Act and it takes all the colonial borders out. The states' lines stay there, but they're no longer borders. There's no longer a need to show documents to cross the line, and there never will be again after what they did to us through COVID. But they took all this out. This is their way of doing things. The treasonous political parties under the guidance of Gough Whitlam created the abstract Queen of Australia in 1973. There's her sign, there's her seal there. Gough Whitlam created that. The Queen didn't create that. Gough did. There's the Queen's emblem, that's her seal. Come forward to the current day. Constitution of the Commonwealth of Australia. Continued use of the Great Seal of Australia authorised for use by Royal Warrant 19th of October 1973. So the fraudulent seal, right? And now the General, the Honourable David Hurley, AC, DSC, retired, Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia, acting with the advice of the Federal Executive Council, because he gets told what to do by the council. He doesn't make his own mind up anymore. He's gone now. But the Executive Council tell him what to do. And under Section 61 of the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Australia, authorised the continued use of the Great Seal of Australia, which was first authorised for use by Royal Warrant 19th of October 1973, pending the granting of a new seal by King Charles III. So they were to get a new seal from King Charles III, which would have him standing there with a sword or a horse or something, but it would be his seal. Now, this was done in September 2022. So this has been in process for 2 years. And this is what they've got. I know for a fact that King Charles did not have one thing to do with the design of this thing. It looks like a big 50-cent piece, really. There is no monarch listed on there. There is no crown authority on that seal. That seal, what it actually is, and you have to get your head around this, that seal is the company seal of the corporate Commonwealth of Australia and nothing else. That seal only has authority over the employees of the corporate Commonwealth of Australia. That seal has no claim on you or me or anybody else living in this country. That is simply, look, I've got two companies, I've got two different seals. This is just a company seal for the corporate Commonwealth of Australia. Now, Rod Cullerton, I'm going to go through this. I've shortened it down a fair bit. This was a Freedom of Information letter, and you can find these documents that I put up here. You'll find them on our website, ourtrueaustralia.com, and you'll find these documents, right, in their full, right? So, Mr. Cullerton, Freedom of Information Act, decision letter. The purpose of this letter is to give you a decision about your request to access documents under the Freedom of Information Act 1982, which your submission to the Attorney General's Department, your request on 2nd of September 21, you wrote the Department request access to the information regarding the Great Seal of the Commonwealth of Australia and termination. On the 6th of September 21, you were advised that your correspondence had been provided to the relevant officers for consideration. On the 15th of September 21, an officer of the Department of Freedom of Information and Privacy Section acknowledged your request to B4. Now, here we go. In light of the letter of Mr. David Lewis dated the 16th of August 21 in response to my request for information dated the 22nd of July 21 and my reference above regarding the authority to terminate the Great Seal of the Commonwealth of Australia, I request the instrument that overrides, suspends or terminates the indissoluble federal Commonwealth under the Crown of the United Kingdom as qualified by the second clause that binds the Crown and the fifth clause that binds the people, that ought to have been in place at the time, 1973, in making the change of authority to the Australian government. With reference to the termination of the Commonwealth by substitution of the jurisdiction taking to be solely under the authority of the Australian government without the Crown, I request the acknowledgement of the Australian people via the alteration by process of Section 128, referendum. Let's have a referendum. Do you want to change the Great Seal? Right? It's part of the Constitution, or otherwise termination of the Commonwealth and substitution in current practice today. With reference to the termination of the Commonwealth, I request the publication of sufficient notice to the Australian people of that change. In light of the current text of the Constitution and prefacing clauses in the light of the celebration of the centenary of the Commonwealth held in 2001. So what they were asking for is, show us the referendum or the documents that allowed the Parliament, the then Parliament in 1973, to just terminate the Great Seal of the Commonwealth and change it to the Great Seal of Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of Australia, the fictitious watery tart out of Lake Burley Griffin. To identify documents for your request, I arrange for staff likely to be able to identify documents to undertake comprehensive searches for the relevant department of electronic holdings, and in particular, a departmental staff member with responsibility for processing FOI requests, integrated the department's record management system using search terms which were developed with reference to the information provided in the scope of your request. Despite these efforts, no relevant documents were identified. They had no authority, there is no documents, there's no record of them doing it. They just went ahead and did it by stealth. They did it by fraud. They stole the country. And you were too busy playing football, meat pies, kangaroos, and holding cards. Well, that day's long gone. Long gone. You see, that's the fraud. Fraud and deception. The Public Governance Performance Accountability Act 2013. Today, there are two types of Commonwealth entities. Only one is lawful. A corporate Commonwealth entity, which is a Commonwealth entity that is a body corporate. Now, a body corporate can't make laws or rules or any of that stuff. But anyway, a non-corporate Commonwealth entity, which is a Commonwealth entity that is not a body corporate. So the non-corporate Commonwealth entity is the Commonwealth as you and I would expect it, as the ordinary man would understand it to be. The corporate Commonwealth entities are legally separate from the Commonwealth, whereas non-corporate Commonwealth entities are part of the Commonwealth. Now, hold on. This is going to get a little exciting. Just hold on, right? The legislative power of the Commonwealth shall be vested in the federal parliament, which shall consist of the Queen, a Senate and a House of Representatives, and which is hereinafter called the Parliament or the Parliament of the Commonwealth, not the Parliament of Australia or the Australian Parliament. The Parliament of Australia or the Australian Parliament is wholly unknown within the Constitution. Why? It is a body corporate, a corporation acting as government. Now, the Fair Work Act says if you have an ABN number and you employ people, you're a corporation. Under the Australian consumer law, corporations are required for a written contract, wedding signature with all parties if you want to interact with each other. And full and total disclosure to every aspect of the contract to do business with anyone. If a state government tries to establish a local government ABN corporation is automatically regarded as a corporation and it therefore cannot be government. Once a government body converts to a corporation, it cannot revert back to a government, so says the rules of the High Court, ex parte Boilermakers with Kirby. A corporation cannot create laws, enforce laws, raise taxes, or produce. So we're going to be asking, produce the laws and documents that evidence this is not the truth and fact of law. Interesting.